Good evening, everyone. Tonight we descend into the forgotten corners of Pennsylvania, where the Rust Belt crumbles into Appalachian shadow, where coal towns remember what was buried in their mines, and where farmland stretches silent under skies that haven't been kind in decades. These are the places travelers pass through without stopping, the dots on maps that make people check their fuel gauge and keep driving. The stories we're about to share don't come from newspapers or official records, though some left traces there. They come from whispered confessions in diner booths, from testimonies given to priests who couldn't offer absolution, from letters written to family members who stopped responding. They come from people who saw something in Pennsylvania's small towns that changed them forever. Something that lives in the space between the old world and the new, between what we're told is real and what we know in our bones to be true. If you're drawn to the kind of truth that lingers in the dark, make sure to subscribe and stay with us tonight. The furnace was breathing wrong. I was standing at the top of the basement stairs in the rental house on Maple Street, listening to the rhythmic sound coming from below. It wasn't the normal click and hum of an old oil furnace cycling on. It was slower, deeper, more deliberate. In, pause, out, in, pause, out. Like lungs. Like something down there was sleeping and I'd woken it up by turning on the basement light. The house was in Centralia, or what was left of it. Most people knew the name from the mine fire that had been burning under the town since 1962. The disaster that turned a community of over 1,000 into a ghost town of fewer than 10. But some houses were still standing on the safe edges, still technically habitable, and the rent was cheap enough that I hadn't asked too many questions. I'd moved there for work, taking a contract job documenting abandoned infrastructure for a historical preservation group. The project would last 6 months, and I needed somewhere affordable to stay. Lauren Voss, 31 years old, freelance photographer and architectural historian, practical to a fault. I'd never believed in anything I couldn't measure or photograph. Ghosts were psychology. Hauntings were carbon monoxide. There was always an explanation. But that breathing sound had no explanation I could accept. I descended the stairs slowly, my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness the weak bulb couldn't reach. The basement was unfinished, just concrete walls and exposed joists, with the furnace squatting in the far corner like something that had grown there instead of being installed. The breathing got louder as I approached. Not coming from the furnace exactly, but from behind it, from the wall. I moved closer, pressing my ear against the cold concrete. The breathing was clearer now, and I could feel it too. A subtle vibration, warm air pulsing against the foundation like the house itself had respiratory system. The wall was slightly warm to the touch, warmer than it should be even with the furnace running. There was a crack in the concrete, hairline thin, running from floor to ceiling. I hadn't noticed it during my initial walk through when I'd rented the place. Warm air was seeping from it, carrying a smell that made me step back. Sulfur and something organic, like turned earth and decay, mixing with the sharp chemical burn of coal smoke. The mine fire. I was smelling the mine fire that had been burning under Centralia for over 60 years, burning through coal seams that ran for miles in every direction. But the maps I'd seen showed this house was outside the danger zone, far enough from the active fire that the ground was stable. The air was safe. This shouldn't be happening. I took photos of the crack, documenting it the way I documented everything. Through the camera lens, I saw something that made my hands shake. The crack was wider in the photos than it appeared to my naked eye. And there was something visible in the gap, not rock or soil, but something that looked almost like tissue, glistening and dark, expanding and contracting with each breath. I went upstairs and called the landlord. He didn't answer. I left a message about the crack, about the smell, about the weird breathing sound. Then I opened every window on the first floor despite the October cold. Worried about carbon monoxide or radon or whatever else might be seeping up from below. That night, I slept on the couch instead of in the bedroom, unwilling to be on the second floor with that breathing basement beneath me. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the basement. Slow, heavy footsteps, pacing back and forth across the concrete floor. I turned on all the lights and waited for dawn, telling myself it was the house settling, the furnace expanding, anything but what it sounded like. Someone walking down there in the dark. In the morning, I checked the basement again. The crack was wider. Definitely wider, now almost an inch at its broadest point. And the breathing had changed. It was faster now, more excited, like whatever was down there knew I was paying attention. I spent that day researching the house's history. The Centralia Public Library still operated out of a small building near the edge of town, staffed by an elderly woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who remembered when Centralia was still a real community. She pulled files for me, old property records and newspaper clippings, her hands shaking slightly as she handed them over. "This is the Henning house," she said quietly. "You're staying in the Henning house." The name meant nothing to me. She could see that in my face. "Michael Henning," she continued. "He was one of the miners who was down in the pit when the fire started. They say it was his cigarette that did it, though nobody ever proved it. Tossed it into what he thought was an old trash heap in an abandoned section. Turned out to be an exposed coal seam." She paused, looking at the address on the property record. "He died in 1987. Lung disease, officially. But people said it was guilt that killed him. Guilt over starting the fire that destroyed the whole town." "Did he live in that house when he died?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "In the basement, toward the end. He said he needed to be close to what he'd done, needed to feel the heat of it. His wife found him down there one morning, sitting in front of the furnace, dead for hours, but still warm. They said his body temperature was 102 degrees, even though he'd been gone since midnight. I thanked her and left, my mind working through the information. A man who died in the basement, who'd been obsessed with the mine fire he might have started. It was the kind of story that would make anyone uneasy in that house. But it still didn't explain the breathing, the crack, the physical impossibility of what I was experiencing. That evening, I set up cameras in the basement. 4 of them, positioned to cover every angle, with motion detection and night vision. If something was moving down there, I'd capture it. If the crack was expanding, I'd have a time-lapse record. Evidence, proof. Something I could show to the landlord, or the fire marshal, or whoever needed to see it to understand that this house was unsafe. I watched the feeds on my laptop from the couch, determined to stay awake all night. The breathing was constant now, audible even on the first floor, a rhythm that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat if I listened too long. Around 11 p.m., the footsteps started again. On the camera feeds, I could see nothing. The basement was empty, the concrete floor undisturbed. But the sound was undeniable, echoing up through the floorboards. At midnight, the crack began to glow. I watched on the laptop screen as a dim orange light seeped from the fissure in the wall, growing brighter with each breath. The cameras picked up a temperature spike. The basement was getting hotter, climbing from 65 degrees to 75, to 85, to 95. The feeds started glitching, pixels distorting, and then all 4 cameras went black simultaneously. I ran to the basement door, but it wouldn't open. The knob turned, the lock wasn't engaged, but the door held fast like someone was pressing against it from the other side. I could hear the breathing clearly now, so loud it sounded like it was right behind the door, like something massive was inhaling and exhaling just inches away. Then I heard the voice. Low, raspy, barely more than a whisper riding on the exhale. "Let it burn, let it all burn. It's the only way to stay warm." The door flew open, and heat rolled out of the basement like I'd opened an oven. The temperature was impossible. I could feel my skin tightening, my eyes drying out instantly. Through the heat distortion, I could see down the stairs to the basement. The crack in the wall had split open, revealing not burning coal or soil, but something that looked like the interior of a throat, red and glistening and pulsing with that steady breathing rhythm. And standing in front of it, translucent and flickering like heat shimmer, was a man. He was wearing mining clothes from decades past, his face gaunt and soot-stained, his eyes fixed on the crack like he was praying to it. His chest rose and fell in perfect synchronization with the breathing from the wall. "Michael Henning," I said, though I don't know why I spoke. Maybe because acknowledging it made it real, made it something I could deal with instead of something I had to deny. He didn't turn toward me, but he spoke again, his voice layered with that deep breathing sound. "I started the fire. I fed it my cigarette and it grew. 60 years now, burning through the veins of the earth. They tried to stop it, but it's alive now. It learned how to breathe, and it's hungry." "It's just a coal fire," I said, but my voice was weak. "It's geology, not—" "It was a coal fire," he interrupted. "Now it's something else. It's been breathing for 60 years, growing, learning. It's got lungs made of tunnels and a heart made of heat, and it's spreading, always spreading. And it's lonely down there in the dark. It wants company. It wants to be fed." The crack widened further, and I could see deeper into it now. Not rock, not earth, but chambers. A network of spaces that expanded and contracted, organic and alive, lined with something that looked like burnt flesh and glowing ember. The mine fire had become something more than combustion. It had become an entity, a living system fed by coal and heat and the guilt of the man who'd started it. "I stay here to keep it satisfied," Michael said. "My heat, my breath, my presence. As long as I'm here, it stays under this house. Stays contained. But if I leave, if I stop feeding it—" He finally turned to look at me, and his face was horrible, burned and rebuilt wrong, eyes too bright, mouth too wide. "It'll spread. It'll find someone else to keep it company." I backed away from the basement door, but the heat followed me. The breathing grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with horror that my own breathing was starting to sync with it. In, pause, out. In, pause, out. Against my will, my lungs were matching the rhythm coming from the basement. I grabbed my car keys and ran. I left everything, my cameras, my equipment, my clothes, my research. I just ran to my car and drove out of Centralia without stopping, without looking back, terrified that if I hesitated for even a moment, I'd find myself walking back into that basement, standing in front of that crack, breathing in perfect synchronization with the thing that lived in the fire. The landlord never returned my calls. I never went back for my belongings. The house is still there, still listed as habitable, still available for rent to anyone desperate or uninformed enough to take it. The official records say the fire marshal inspected it 6 months after I left and found nothing wrong, no structural damage, no evidence of mine fire intrusion. The basement was cool and ordinary, the crack in the wall barely visible, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and I know that somewhere in Centralia, in a basement on Maple Street, something is still breathing. Something that learned how to be alive from burning coal and human guilt. Something that feeds on heat and presence and the rhythm of living lungs. Michael Henning died in 1987, but I don't think he ever left that basement. I think he's still there, keeping watch over the thing he created, using his own ghost as fuel to keep it contained. And I think that if you listen carefully in that house, if you go down into the basement and press your ear against the concrete, you'll hear 2 sets of breathing now. Michael's slow and steady, and the fire's deep and eternal, waiting patiently for the day when there's no one left to feed it, and it can finally spread again, burning through the earth until it consumes everything. The Centralia mine fire has been burning for over 60 years. Scientists say it could burn for another 250, but I don't think it's going to wait that long. I think it's going to find a way out, a way up, a way to breathe open air instead of just exhaling through cracks in basement walls. And when it does, when you see smoke rising from impossible places or feel heat where the ground should be cold, remember that some fires don't just burn. Some of them learn, some of them grow, some of them become alive. If you've ever felt a basement breathing beneath your feet, if you've ever heard footsteps where no one's walking, if you've ever stood too close to something that shouldn't be warm and felt it breathe back at you, don't ignore it. Don't rationalize it. Just leave. Because some places don't want you there as a resident. They want you there as fuel. And the moment you start breathing in rhythm with them, the moment your heart matches their pulse, you'll never leave. You'll just burn, slowly and forever, keeping company with the lonely thing that lives in the fire. The church was full when it shouldn't have been. I was driving through Pithole City at 2 in the morning, taking a shortcut through what used to be one of Pennsylvania's oil boom towns, when I saw the light. Every window in the old Methodist church was glowing yellow warm, and I could hear singing, hymns, old ones, carried on the October wind in perfect harmony. The parking area was empty, no cars, no buses, nothing, but that church was clearly occupied. Pithole City wasn't really a city anymore. It had been briefly in the 1860s when oil was discovered. Population had exploded to over 15,000 in just a few months, then crashed just as fast when the wells ran dry. Now it was barely a ghost town, just a few foundations and historical markers scattered through the woods. The church was one of the only structures still standing, maintained by the State Historical Society as a monument to boom-and-bust economics. It should have been locked, empty, and dark, but it wasn't. I'm Connor Hayes, 43, and I drove a long-haul truck route that sometimes took me through the back roads of northwestern Pennsylvania in the dead hours when most people were sleeping. I'd driven past Pithole City dozens of times and never seen so much as a porch light. The place was abandoned, had been for over a century. But that night, that church was alive with light and sound and what seemed like dozens of voices, singing Rock of Ages in 4-part harmony. I pulled over, telling myself I was just checking to make sure it wasn't vandals or squatters. The Historical Society would want to know if someone was using the building without permission, but really, I was curious. There was something magnetic about that light, that sound, like they were pulling me toward them. I left my truck running and walked up the path to the church. The singing got louder, clearer. I could distinguish individual voices now, men and women, young and old, all blending together with the kind of practiced unity that came from years of singing together every Sunday. The melody was beautiful, achingly beautiful, the kind of sound that made you remember being a child in church, even if you'd never been one. The church door was open. I stood at the threshold looking in, and what I saw made no sense. The interior was full of people, maybe 60 or 70 of them, sitting in the pews facing the pulpit. They were all dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd see in photographs from the 1860s or 1870s. Long dresses on the women, dark suits on the men, children in their Sunday best. Every head was bowed, every hand held a hymnal, every voice joined in the song. But I couldn't see their faces. The light in the church was bright, almost painfully bright from old oil lamps that lined the walls, but somehow every face was in shadow. The angles were wrong. The light should have illuminated them, but instead it seemed to bend around their features, leaving only darkness where eyes and mouths should be. The singing stopped abruptly, all at once, like someone had cut the music. Then, in perfect unison, every head turned toward me. Still no faces visible, just that strange darkness, but I could feel their attention like weight pressing against my chest. "Come in," said a voice from the pulpit. "Come in and join us. We've been waiting." The door swung wider without anyone touching it. The congregation remained silent, watching, waiting. I could smell the church interior now, old wood and lamp oil and something else, something sweet and rotten like flowers that had died weeks ago but were still sitting in their vases. "We need someone new," the voice continued. It was a man's voice, measured and calm, with the practiced cadence of a preacher who'd given 1,000 sermons. "Someone to complete the congregation. We've been waiting so long for someone to arrive during service." I stepped backward, off the threshold. The congregation stirred, a ripple of movement through the pews. The faceless heads tilted in unison, tracking my retreat. "Don't leave," the preacher said. And now there was something pleading in his voice. "Please. We can't finish without a full congregation. We've been singing the same hymns for so long. If we could just complete the service, just once, we could rest." "How long?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why I was engaging in conversation with whatever this was. "Since the fire," he said. "Since the first fire. Since Paitola was abandoned and we chose to stay. We were promised eternal life, eternal worship. We were told this was our purpose. But we've been singing the same songs for over a century, and we're so tired. We need someone to complete us. We need you." I turned and ran back to my truck. Behind me, the singing started again, but different this time. Faster, more desperate, the harmony breaking down into something discordant and wrong. The words were still Rock of Ages, but they were stretched and distorted, overlapping and fragmenting until they sounded like screaming. I got in my truck and drove, not looking back at the church, though I could see its light in my mirrors, impossibly bright, casting shadows that stretched for miles across the empty land. The singing followed me for what felt like hours, carried on the wind or maybe just echoing in my head, not fading until I was 50 miles away and crossing into a different county. I reported it the next day, called the Historical Society and told them someone was using the church, probably some kind of cult or reenactment group. They sent someone to check. The church was empty, locked tight, covered in dust that suggested no one had been inside in years. The oil lamps I'd seen weren't there. They'd been removed to a museum decades ago. There was no evidence of my visit. No footprints in the dust. Nothing. But they found one thing that made the investigator go quiet on the phone. On the back wall of the church, someone had written in what looked like charcoal, "The congregation is incomplete. We wait for the final member. We will always wait." The handwriting was old, the charcoal tested and found to be over 100 years old. It had been there since the 1920s at least, maybe longer. But beneath it, in fresh charcoal, someone had added a date, the date of my visit, written in a different hand. I don't drive through Pithole City anymore. I take the long way around, adding an hour to my route, rather than pass through those dark woods where a church still stands and a congregation still sings. Other truckers have reported seeing the lights, hearing the music. Some have stopped to investigate. 2 never made it back to their trucks. Their vehicles were found idling on the roadside, driver's doors open, keys still in the ignition. The drivers were gone. The official explanation is that they abandoned their trucks for unknown reasons, possibly had some kind of psychological break, and wandered into the woods where they died of exposure. But the search teams found something strange. Both men's footprints led from their trucks to the church door, then stopped. Just stopped, right at the threshold, like they'd ceased to exist the moment they crossed it. Inside the church, during the second search, they found something else. 2 more sets of hymnal bookmarks, 2 more spaces in the pews that showed signs of recent use. The dust had been disturbed in patterns that suggested people sitting, standing, singing. The congregation was growing. The Historical Society closed the church permanently after that, padlocked it, put up fencing, installed cameras. But on certain nights, usually in October or November when the wind blows cold and the moon is dark, Drivers still report seeing lights in those windows. Still hear singing drifting through the trees. Still feel the pull to stop, to investigate, to join whatever's waiting in there. I know what's waiting. I saw them, that faceless congregation, singing their eternal hymns and waiting for someone to complete them. I don't know what happens when they finally get their full attendance, when someone finally crosses that threshold during service and takes that last empty seat. Maybe the service ends and they can rest. Maybe they can finally die the deaths they should have died over a century ago. Or maybe the service never ends. Maybe they just sing forever, adding new voices to their chorus, growing and growing until every person who passes through Pithole City is pulled into that church to stand and sing and become one more faceless shadow in the pews. The boom and bust didn't just destroy the economy of Pithole City. It destroyed something spiritual too, broke something in the people who'd built their lives and faith around oil money that vanished overnight. They'd been promised prosperity, told that God had blessed that land with black gold, that wealth was a sign of divine favor. When the oil ran out, when the money dried up and the population fled, those who stayed must have felt abandoned by both man and God. Maybe they're still waiting for that divine favor to return. Maybe they think if they just keep singing, keep worshiping, keep performing the rituals of faith with perfect dedication, eventually they'll be rewarded. Eventually the oil will flow again, the town will revive, and they'll be vindicated for their faith. But the oil isn't coming back. The town is never coming back. And that congregation is going to sing in the darkness forever, adding any voice they can capture to their eternal service. If you're driving through northwestern Pennsylvania late at night and you see a church with lights in the windows where no church should be lit, don't stop. Don't investigate. Don't let curiosity or concern or that strange magnetic pull draw you toward that music. Just drive faster. Turn your radio up loud to drown out the hymns. And don't look in your rearview mirror until you're far enough away that the light has faded. Because they're always looking for someone to complete the congregation, always waiting for that final member who will let them finish what they started. And if you walk through that door during service, if you take that last empty seat, you'll sing with them forever. Your face will dissolve into shadow, your voice will blend into the chorus, and you'll wait through decades and centuries for the next traveler to pass by and hear the music and think maybe, just maybe, they should stop and see what's going on in that old church in the woods. The congregation is still incomplete. They're still waiting, and they've got nothing but time. The patient in room 307 died 3 times that week. I was working the night shift at Greystone Psychiatric Hospital in Butler County, the old wing that the state kept threatening to close, but never quite did. Room 307 was at the end of the longest hallway on the 3rd floor, and every night that week I'd gone in for bed checks and found the patient, Thomas Mercer, 67, diagnosed with late-stage dementia, lying perfectly still, with no pulse, no breath, no signs of life. And every time, by the time I'd called the code and the emergency team arrived, he'd be breathing again, sitting up, asking what all the fuss was about. The 3rd time it happened, Dr. Reese pulled me aside. "Stop calling codes on Mercer," she said. "His chart shows a DNR. We're not supposed to resuscitate anyway. You're wasting everyone's time." But I hadn't resuscitated him. I hadn't done anything. He'd just come back. On his own. Like death couldn't quite hold him. I'm Maya Patel, 28. And I'd been a psychiatric nurse for 4 years, 2 of them at Greystone. I'd seen a lot in those years. Patients who talked to people who weren't there, patients who insisted they were someone else, patients who'd done terrible things and didn't remember them. But I'd never seen someone die and spontaneously revive without any medical intervention. It violated everything I understood about biology. Room 307 had a reputation. The older nurses wouldn't go in there alone after midnight, would send the newer staff or wait until morning rounds. When I asked why, They gave vague answers about bad feelings and weird energy. I'd assumed it was superstition, the kind that accumulated around any old institutional building. Greystone had been operating since 1891, and buildings that old collected stories the way they collected dust. But after the third death and revival of Thomas Mercer, I started paying more attention to room 307. The room was isolated at the far end of a hallway that didn't get much traffic. The overhead lights flickered constantly, creating patterns of shadow that moved across the walls in ways that didn't quite match the rhythm of the fluorescent tubes. The air temperature was wrong too, always colder than the other rooms, cold enough that you could see your breath sometimes even though the thermostat read 72 degrees. Thomas Mercer didn't seem to notice the cold. He sat in his bed or in the chair by the window, staring at the wall, occasionally muttering things that made no sense. Most dementia patients had some lucidity, moments when they'd recognize you or engage in conversation. Thomas never did. He was locked somewhere deep inside himself, only surfacing to eat or use the bathroom or die and come back. On my fourth night shift that week, I decided to stay in his room during the death window. The previous incidents had all happened between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. I wanted to see what was actually happening, wanted evidence that I could show Dr. Reese to prove this wasn't normal, wasn't something we should be ignoring. I brought a chair into room 307 at 1:45 a.m. and sat down where I could watch both Thomas and the door. He was awake, sitting up in bed, staring at the wall like always. His eyes were unfocused, mouth slightly open, hands folded in his lap. He looked like a mannequin someone had propped up and forgotten about. At 2:17 a.m., he spoke. Clear, coherent, completely unlike his usual muttering. "They're coming for collection?" I leaned forward. "Who's coming, Thomas?" "The ones who were here before. The ones who never left when they closed the ward. They take something every night, a breath, a heartbeat, a piece of memory. They're trying to remember what it was like to be alive." His eyes focused on me for the first time since I'd started my shift. "You should leave. They only take from the patients usually, but if you're here during collection, they might take from you too." "What ward are you talking about?" I asked. "What closed ward?" "The fourth floor, where they kept the ones who couldn't be fixed. Where they did the procedures." His voice was getting softer, his focus drifting. "The hospital tried to forget about the fourth floor, sealed it off, said it never existed. But the patients remember. The patients always remember." I knew there wasn't a fourth floor. Greystone was 3 stories, always had been according to every blueprint and record. But Thomas was talking about it like he'd been there, like he knew it intimately. At 2:31 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath now, thick clouds of it. Thomas stopped talking mid-sentence, his eyes going wide. He was looking past me, at something behind me, and the expression on his face was pure terror. I turned around slowly. The door to room 307 was still closed, but there were shapes in the room with us now. Not quite people, more like the impression of people. Dark spots in the air that absorbed light and warmth. There were 4 of them, moving slowly toward the bed, and as they moved, I could hear sounds. Wet, labored breathing, the scrape of something metal dragging across tile, a low humming that might have been machinery or voices or both. Thomas started screaming, but no sound came out. His mouth was open, his body rigid, but the scream was silent like they'd taken his voice before it could form. The shapes surrounded his bed, and I watched in horror as they reached toward him with appendages that weren't quite arms, touching his chest, his head, his throat. His vitals monitor flatlined. No pulse, no respiration, no brain activity. He was dead, clinically and completely dead, but his eyes were still open, still aware, still screaming silently. The shapes stayed for exactly 3 minutes. I watched the clock, unable to move, unable to help, frozen by a fear so profound it felt like paralysis. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone. The temperature rose. The sound stopped, and Thomas gasped, his lungs filling with air, his heart monitor showing a steady beat again. He looked at me with tears running down his face. "They took my daughter's name," he whispered. "I can't remember my daughter's name anymore. I know I had a daughter. I can see her face, but they took her name and now she's just a face without an identity." I ran from room 307 and found Dr. Reese in her office. I told her everything, the shapes, the temperature drop, the way Thomas died and revived, what he'd said about the 4th floor. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened a locked drawer in her desk and pulled out a file, an old file, yellowed with age, labeled Incident Report, June 1957. "There was a 4th floor," she said quietly. "This building used to be twice as tall. The top 2 floors were torn down in 1958, officially because of structural concerns. Unofficially," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "there were experimental treatments happening up there. Procedures that weren't approved, weren't legal. Shock therapy beyond any acceptable protocol, insulin coma therapy. Lobotomies performed by doctors who weren't qualified. Patients died. A lot of patients died. Why wasn't this reported?" I asked. It was 1957. Mental health patients had no rights, no advocates. The families who'd committed them wanted them forgotten anyway. When the procedures went wrong and people died, the hospital just absorbed them, buried them in unmarked graves on the property, pretended they'd never existed. And the 4th floor? They demolished it to destroy evidence, removed every record, every file, every mention of what had happened up there. But buildings remember, Maya. Places remember. And the patients who died up there, who were taken apart by procedures that destroyed their minds and identities before destroying their bodies, they're still trying to understand what happened to them. Thomas said they take something every night. Dr. Reese nodded. Memory, identity, life force, whatever you want to call it. The entities that remain from the 4th floor are trying to reconstruct themselves, trying to remember who they were before the hospital took everything from them. So they take from the patients down here, stealing pieces to fill the gaps in their own missing identities. "We have to stop it," I said. "We have to do something." "What would you suggest?" "Blessing the building, demolishing it. The state won't approve either. This is a functioning facility. We have 60 patients who need care. Where would they go?" "Somewhere that isn't feeding them to ghosts every night." Dr. Reese closed the file. "I've worked here for 15 years. I've seen what happens in room 307 and a dozen other rooms on the 3rd floor. I've watched patients lose memories, lose personality, lose pieces of themselves night after night, and I've learned that there's nothing we can do except try to minimize the exposure. Don't put patients in 307 unless we have no choice. Don't staff the 3rd floor alone after midnight. Don't stay in the rooms during the collection window. So we just let it happen? We don't have a choice. The hospital needs room 307. We're always over capacity, and whatever's taking from the patients, it's been doing it for over 60 years. It's not going to stop because we asked nicely." I worked the rest of that week in a daze, avoiding room 307, avoiding the 3rd floor when I could. Thomas Mercer died 2 more times before the week ended. Each time he came back with a little less. Couldn't remember his hometown after the 4th death. Couldn't remember his profession after the 5th. The entities were dismantling him piece by piece, harvesting his identity to reconstruct their own. He died for the final time on Sunday night. The code team couldn't revive him that time, couldn't get his heart started no matter what they tried. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest complicated by dementia and advanced age. But I knew the truth. They'd taken the last piece they needed from him. They'd drained him completely, used him up, and discarded what remained. I quit Greystone 2 weeks later, I couldn't keep working in a place where I knew what was happening, where I knew that patients were being sacrificed to something that should have been laid to rest decades ago. Dr. Reese accepted my resignation without surprise. She'd seen other nurses leave for the same reasons, watched the pattern repeat itself every few years. The hospital is still operating. Room 307 is still in use. The third floor still gets cold after midnight. And patients still die and revive in ways that don't make medical sense. The official records show nothing unusual, just the normal mortality rate for a psychiatric facility with an elderly population. But the nurses who work there know. They know about the fourth floor that doesn't exist anymore. They know about the entities that come for collection. They know that when you work the night shift at Greystone, you're not just caring for the living. You're feeding something that died wrong, something that's trying to piece itself back together, one stolen memory at a time. If you ever visit someone at a psychiatric hospital and you notice a room at the end of a long hallway where the lights flicker and the air is cold, don't ask to see inside. Don't volunteer to sit with a patient there. Because some rooms in old institutions aren't really rooms anymore. They're feeding grounds, harvesting floors, collection points for things that should have died decades ago, but were too broken to know how. And if you're a patient assigned to one of those rooms, if you wake up in the night and see shapes around your bed that aren't quite human, remember this. They're taking something from you. A memory, a name, a piece of who you are. And when they've taken enough, when there's nothing left of you to take, you won't die. You'll just stop being you. You'll become another empty shape wandering through the building, another collector looking for pieces to fill the void where your identity used to be. The fourth floor of Greystone was demolished in 1958, but what happened there never really ended. It just moved down one level and kept going, kept taking, kept collecting. And it's still there, every night after midnight, in room 327 and the other rooms along that hallway, where the fluorescent lights flicker and the temperature drops and something that used to be human reaches out to steal what it can never get back. The car was still running when they found it. Engine idling, headlights pointed straight at the bridge, driver's door hanging open like someone had gotten out in a hurry and forgotten to close it behind them. The radio was on, playing static between stations. The keys were in the ignition. The phone was on the passenger seat, unlocked, showing a call log with 16 missed calls from Mom. But Jennifer Hartley was gone. The 24-year-old graduate student had been driving home to Erie from Pittsburgh on a Friday night in November, taking Cider Mill Road because Google Maps said it was 10 minutes faster than the highway. She'd called her mother at 9:47 p.m. to say she'd be home by 11. At 10:15 p.m., her phone pinged the cell tower nearest to the bridge. At 10:18 p.m., a passing truck driver saw her car sitting there with the door open and called it in. She vanished in 3 minutes. In 3 minutes, Jennifer Hartley went from talking to her mother to simply not existing anymore. I know because I was the state trooper who took the initial report, who searched that bridge and the woods around it, who interviewed everyone who'd driven Cider Mill Road that night. Bradley Morrison, 36 years old, Pennsylvania State Police out of the Clarion Barracks. I'd worked missing persons cases before, knew the statistics, knew that most disappearances had mundane explanations. But this one was different from the start. The bridge itself was old, built in 1932 to replace an even older covered bridge that had burned down. Single lane, stone and steel, crossing Red Bank Creek at a point where the water ran deep and fast between steep banks. There were no railings, just the bare bridge deck and a 50-foot drop to the creek below. Locals avoided it when they could, said the approach angles were tricky and the bridge deck got slick even in light rain. But the weather that night was clear. Jennifer was an experienced driver, sober according to the toxicology on the coffee cup we found in her car. There was no reason for her to get out of the car, no mechanical problem, no flat tire, nothing wrong with the vehicle at all. She'd just stopped, gotten out. disappeared. We searched the creek first, assuming she'd somehow fallen or jumped, despite the car being 15 feet from the bridge edge. Divers found nothing, no body, no clothes, no evidence she'd ever touched the water. We searched the woods on both sides of the road, using dogs and thermal imaging and volunteers who walked in formation calling her name. Nothing. Her phone records showed she hadn't made any calls or texts after talking to her mother. Her bank accounts showed no activity. Her social media went silent. It was like she'd driven to that bridge and simply ceased to exist at 10:18 p.m. on November 13th. 3 days into the investigation, I talked to the locals. Not the official interviews. Those had all been dead ends. People who hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard anything. I went to the bar in Brookville, the one where the old-timers drank and told stories. I bought a round and asked about the bridge on Cider Mill Road. The conversation died. Just stopped, like someone had hit a mute button. Men who'd been laughing and arguing a moment before suddenly found their beers fascinating. Finally, one of them, guy named Earl, must have been 70, said quietly, "You're asking about the crossing." "I'm asking about a missing girl," I said. "Same thing." He took a long drink. Bridge on Cider Mill Road isn't just a bridge, it's a crossing, between here and somewhere else. Most nights it's just a bridge, but sometimes, when conditions are right, it's more. It's a doorway, and people who stop on it when it's open. He trailed off, shaking his head. Open to what? Nobody knows. Other side, maybe, someplace else. The old covered bridge that stood there before, it burned down in 1931. Killed 7 people, trapped them on the bridge when the fire started at both ends. They say those people are still there, still trying to cross, still looking for a way out, and sometimes they find someone to take their place, someone who stops at the wrong moment, gets out of their car when they should keep driving, and steps across into wherever they went when they burned. I thanked him for the story and left, not believing a word of it. But I couldn't get it out of my head. 7 people dead in a fire. I looked it up when I got home. It was true. March 14th, 1931, the covered bridge on Cider Mill Road had burned. 7 people dead, though the newspaper accounts were vague about how exactly it happened. Just that a fire started, the bridge went up, and 7 people didn't make it off in time. I started looking at other reports from Cider Mill Road, going back through the archives. What I found made me stop sleeping well. 1947. Man found dead in his car on the bridge. No apparent cause. Vehicle was still running, no signs of violence. Autopsy inconclusive. 1963. Woman disappeared after calling for a tow truck. Said her car had stalled on the bridge. Tow truck arrived 20 minutes later. Car was gone, woman was gone, no trace of either. 1978. 2 teenagers vanished. Their car was found on the bridge with both doors open, radio playing, keys in the ignition. Never seen again. 1989. Body found in the creek below the bridge. Male, early 20s. Identified as having gone missing in 1974 from a different county. Cause of death, smoke inhalation. But he'd been dead for 15 years. How do you inhale smoke for 15 years? The pattern was there if you looked for it. Every 7 to 12 years, someone disappeared from that bridge or died there in ways that made no medical sense. Always at night. Always in the fall or winter. Always with their vehicle left running and doors open like they'd just stepped out for a moment. I went back to Cider Mill Road at night. Alone, which was against protocol, but I needed to see it without the distraction of a search team or media or family members asking questions I couldn't answer. I parked before the bridge and walked the approach, looking for anything we might have missed. The bridge looked ordinary. Old, yes. A bit deteriorated, yes. But just a bridge, just stone and steel crossing a creek. I walked out onto it, my footsteps echoing off the deck. The sound of the creek rushing below me amplified by the understructure. At the center of the bridge, I stopped, and the moment I stopped moving, everything changed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The sound of the creek cut off like someone had soundproofed the world, and I could smell smoke, thick, choking smoke, wood and tar, and something else, something organic and horrible. The smell of a covered bridge burning, the smell of people burning. I heard voices, 7 of them, overlapping, calling out in panic and pain. They were coming from both ends of the bridge simultaneously, which should have been impossible. Words were unclear, but the emotion was crystal. Terror, agony, desperation. And then I saw them. Not clearly, just impressions. Shapes made of smoke and shadow standing at both ends of the bridge, blocking the exits. They were holding something, beams maybe, or tools, something they were using to keep the bridge blocked while it burned around them. Except the bridge wasn't burning. The bridge hadn't burned in over 90 years, but these shapes were still here, still holding those positions, still keeping people from escaping a fire that existed in a different time. I tried to move, tried to run back to my car, but my feet wouldn't obey. I was frozen at the center of the bridge, the same way those 7 people had been frozen when the fire trapped them. The same way Jennifer Hartley must have been frozen when she got out of her car and walked to this exact spot. The shapes moved closer, approaching from both sides. As they got nearer, I could see details I didn't want to see. Charred clothes, burned flesh, empty eye sockets that had been consumed by fire. They weren't ghosts. They were the moment of death, preserved and repeating over and over forever. One of them reached toward me, and where its hand touched my arm, I felt heat. Burning heat, like a brand. It was trying to pull me across, pull me into that moment when the bridge burned and 7 people died screaming. I don't know how I broke free, maybe I didn't. Maybe they let me go. Maybe 7 was enough and they didn't need an 8th. But suddenly I was running, my feet hitting the bridge deck with thuds that echoed like drum beats, the shapes behind me keeping pace easily, and then I was off the bridge on solid ground. And the moment I cleared the stone abutment, everything snapped back to normal. Temperature returned. Sound returned. The smell of smoke vanished. When I looked back at the bridge, it was just a bridge again. Empty, ordinary, showing no sign of what had just happened. I drove straight to the barracks and filed a report recommending the bridge be closed. I documented everything, the cold spot, the sounds, the shapes, all of it. My supervisor read it, looked at me for a long moment, then filed it away without comment. The bridge stayed open. Jennifer Hartley was never found. The case is still listed as open, but there's no investigation anymore. Her family held a memorial service 6 months later. Her mother asked me if I thought she was still alive somewhere. I lied and said yes, because what else could I say? That I thought her daughter had been pulled into a moment of death from 1931. That she was trapped in a fire that burned 90 years ago. That she was one of the shapes now standing at the ends of that bridge, waiting for someone else to stop at the wrong time. The bridge is still there. Still in use. Local traffic mostly avoids it, but GPS still routes people through there. Still shaves 10 minutes off the drive by sending them down Cider Mill Road. And every few years, someone stops. Someone's car stalls, or they get out to look at something, or they just pause for a moment at the wrong place at the wrong time. And they cross over. From this moment to that moment. From this bridge to the bridge that burned. From living to something that's not quite dead, but not alive anymore either. I transferred out of Clarion 6 months later, requested a position closer to Pittsburgh where the roads were well lit and heavily traveled, and nothing disappeared except my faith that the world made sense. But I still think about that bridge, still dream about it, still see those shapes made of smoke and shadow, still smell that burning, still feel the heat of the hand that touched my arm. I have a scar there now, a burn mark shaped like fingers. It appeared the morning after that night on the bridge. My doctor couldn't explain it, said it looked like a 3rd-degree burn that had somehow healed wrong, though I'd never reported being burned. It doesn't hurt, but it's always warm to the touch. Always the temperature of fire. If you're driving through western Pennsylvania and your GPS tries to route you through Cider Mill Road, take the long way. Take the highway, even if it adds time. Don't trust a shortcut that crosses that bridge, and if you do end up there, if you find yourself approaching that stone span over Red Bank Creek, don't stop. Don't slow down. Don't get out of your car for any reason. Just drive across and keep driving until you're miles away. Until you can't smell smoke anymore, until the temperature feels right and sounds feel normal and you're sure you're still in the present moment and not slipping backward into the past, where 7 people are burning forever and looking for someone to take their place. The bridge is still open, the crossing is still active, and every 7 to 12 years, someone who doesn't know the stories, someone who just wants to get home a little faster, will stop at the wrong moment and learn too late that some bridges don't just cross rivers. Some of them cross time, cross death, cross the boundary between here and whatever comes after. And once you cross that boundary, you can't come back. You just burn forever, waiting at the ends of a bridge that doesn't exist anymore, trying to trap the next traveler in the moment that killed you. The house came with a family I'd never met. I was sorting through my grandfather's estate after his death, boxing up his apartment in Philadelphia, when the lawyer mentioned the property. "There's also the house in Tionesta," he said casually, like it was a minor detail. "Been in your family since the 1880s. Your grandfather never mentioned it." He hadn't. I'd never heard of Tionesta. Had to look it up on a map. Small town in the Allegheny National Forest, population under 500, about as remote as you could get in Pennsylvania. The lawyer said the property taxes were current, the house was supposedly in decent shape, and it was mine now along with everything else. I drove up in late October to see what I'd inherited. The town of Tionesta was charming in a faded way, the kind of place where the best days were clearly behind it. The house was 3 miles outside of town on a dirt road that wound through thick forest. 2-story Victorian, probably beautiful once, now showing its age in peeling paint and a sagging porch. But structurally sound, or so it appeared. The key was under the mat, exactly where the lawyer said it would be. Inside, the house was furnished, every room complete as if someone might return any moment. Clean, too, surprisingly clean for a place that supposedly hadn't been occupied in years. The furniture was antique. The wallpaper was ancient, but everything was orderly, maintained, waiting. In the living room, above the fireplace, hung a family portrait. Large, oil painting, probably from the late 1800s based on the clothing. A man, a woman, and 5 children, ranging from maybe age 4 to 15. They were all staring directly at the viewer with expressions that were almost but not quite smiling. There was something off about their eyes, something that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't identify why. Simone Larkin, 42, art dealer from Philadelphia. That's who I was, who I'd always been. I evaluated paintings for a living, understood technique and composition and period-appropriate style. This portrait was good work, probably worth something, but there was something wrong with it that I couldn't quite articulate. The proportions were slightly off, or the perspective was skewed, or something about the faces didn't match the clothing period. I took a photo of it to research later, then continued exploring. The kitchen was old, but functional. The dining room had a table set for 7. Upstairs, the bedrooms were furnished with different styles, one clearly for adults, 5 others for children of varying ages. Each child's room had personal items still arranged on the dressers and shelves. Toys, books, hairbrushes, small trinkets. It felt like the family in the portrait had just stepped out and would return any moment. In the master bedroom, I found a journal in the nightstand. Old, leather-bound, with entries dating from 1889 to 1891. I sat on the bed and read. The journal belonged to Elizabeth Hartwick, the mother in the portrait. The entries started normally. Daily life in a frontier community, struggles with weather and isolation. Small joys of children growing and seasons changing. But around the middle of 1890, the tone shifted. "The children have started speaking in turns," she wrote. "One will begin a sentence and another will finish it, even if they're in different rooms. They claim they can hear each other's thoughts now. David says it's the house teaching them, that the walls remember every voice that's ever been spoken here and share that knowledge with those who listen. Later, I can't tell the children apart anymore. I know their names, know their faces, but when I look at them, I see the same person repeated 5 times. They move in synchronization. They finish each other's meals. When one is hurt, all 5 show the bruise." And finally, dated November 3rd, 1891. "David has been gone 3 days. He went to town for supplies and never returned. The children say he's still here, that he never left, that I'm confused. They point to empty chairs and say, 'Father is sitting there, Mother. Why can't you see him?' I'm starting to doubt my own memory. Was he real? Did I imagine our life together? The children are so certain he's here. Maybe I'm the one who's wrong." The journal ended there, mid-page, like Elizabeth had stopped mid-thought and never picked it up again. I closed the book feeling deeply uneasy. This was clearly my family. Hartwick was my grandfather's middle name, the inherited property line traced back through his mother's side. But I'd never heard these names, never seen this portrait, never been told about a family home in Tionesta. As I was putting the journal back, I heard voices downstairs. Children's voices, high and clear, talking and laughing. I froze, listening. The voices were distinct. Multiple children, at least 3 or 4, having a conversation I couldn't quite make out. I walked to the top of the stairs and looked down. The living room was empty, but the voices continued, coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the house like they were in the walls themselves. "Hello," I called. "Who's there?" The voices stopped. Silence. Then, from directly behind me, a child's voice said, "Are you family?" I spun around. The hallway was empty. No one there. But the voice had been right behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck. "Yes," I answered, because somehow that seemed important. "I'm family. Elizabeth was my great-great-great-grandmother." "Then you can stay," the voice said. "You can join us. We've been waiting for more family. We've been alone for so long." Other voices joined in, coming from every direction now, surrounding me. All children's voices, all speaking the same words in perfect unison. "Stay with us. Be family. We're all family here. Family never leaves. Family stays forever." I ran. Down the stairs, through the living room, out the front door onto the porch. Behind me, the children's voices grew louder, more insistent, calling me back. "Don't go, don't go. Family doesn't leave. Family stays. Family is forever." I got in my car and drove back to town, my hands shaking on the wheel. At the Historical Society in Tionesta, an elderly volunteer helped me research the house. The Hartwick family, she confirmed, had owned it since 1884. David and Elizabeth Hartwick and their 5 children. But there was a mystery, she said. In 1891, the entire family had vanished, just disappeared from town and from record. The house remained furnished, maintained by a trust, but no bodies were ever found. No explanation given. "Some people say they never left," the volunteer told me. "Say if you go to that house on certain nights, you can hear them. The children playing, Elizabeth cooking, David reading aloud, like they're still living there, still going through their routines." "Has anyone tried to live there since?" I asked. "Oh, a few times over the years. Never works out. They last a few weeks, maybe a month. Then they leave in the middle of the night. Won't talk about what happened. Some of them looked changed, like they'd aged years in just weeks, like something had been taken from them." I went back to Philadelphia and tried to sell the property. But every buyer who toured the house backed out immediately. One couple made it as far as the living room before leaving, the wife pale and shaking. She wouldn't say what she'd seen, just that she could never live there, could never bring her children there. The house sat empty, technically, but property management reports showed the utilities were being used. Lights came on at night, water ran, heat was used in winter, as if someone was living there, though no one was. I went back once more, 6 months later, determined to clear out the house and at least salvage the furniture and art. The portrait was still above the fireplace, but it had changed. There were now 8 figures in it instead of 7. 2 adults, 6 children. The new child was at the far right, partially obscured, but I could see enough detail to make my blood freeze. The new child was wearing modern clothes, jeans and a graphic t-shirt. Clothes from this century, not the 1800s. I checked the bedrooms. There was a 6th child's room now, one that hadn't been there before. Fresh clothes in the dresser, modern toys on the shelves, a backpack by the bed with school books from the Tionesta Elementary School dated from 3 years ago. In town, I asked about missing children. The librarian got quiet, then nodded slowly. "The Morrison boy," she said, "went missing in 2019. He'd been playing near the old Hartwick house. They searched for weeks, never found a trace." "His clothes," I said. "What was he wearing?" She pulled up a missing person poster on her computer. Jeans and a graphic t-shirt, exactly what the new figure in the portrait was wearing. "The house is still there. Still in my name. I can't sell it, can't demolish it, can't transfer it to anyone else. The trust conditions won't allow it. It has to stay in the family, has to pass to the next Hartwick descendant. When I die, it will go to my sister's children, and eventually they'll visit. Eventually, they'll hear the voices of the children in the walls, asking if they're family, inviting them to stay. Because the house needs family, the Hartwicks need family. They've been waiting since 1891, adding to their numbers slowly, taking in anyone with Hartwick blood who stays too long, who listens too carefully to the voices in the walls. The portrait shows 8 figures now, but there's room for more. The canvas extends beyond the frame, and if you look carefully at the edges, you can see the beginning of new shapes, new figures waiting to be fully painted in, waiting for more family to arrive. Waiting for someone who belongs to them by blood and inheritance and the cruel logic of trust documents that bind the living to the dead. I'll never go back to Tionesta. I'll never set foot in that house again. But I know it's waiting. I know that eventually, when I'm old or sick or weak enough, I'll feel the pull. I'll hear the voices calling me home, telling me that family belongs together, that family is forever. That there's a place at the table for me, a figure waiting to be completed in that portrait, a room upstairs with my name on it, even though I've never lived there. The house came with a family I'd never met. And sooner or later, whether I want to or not, I'll meet them, I'll join them. I'll become one more face in that portrait, frozen in the moment when family meant something darker than love. If you inherit property in Pennsylvania, especially in the remote areas where forests grow thick and towns are small, research it carefully. Find out who lived there before, what happened to them, whether they ever really left. Because some inheritances come with conditions you can't see in the paperwork. Conditions written in blood and painted in oil and whispered by children who never grew old. And once you accept that inheritance, once you claim that property as yours, it claims you back. Forever. The viaduct shouldn't have been humming. I was standing at the base of the Kinsua Bridge, looking up at what remained of it after the 2003 tornado, and I could hear a low vibration coming from the twisted metal towers. It was 2 a.m. I was alone, and the structure that had been dead and silent for 18 years was producing a sound like electricity running through wires, like something massive was moving across tracks that no longer existed. The Kinzua Viaduct used to be an engineering marvel, a railroad bridge over 300 feet tall, stretching 2,053 feet across the valley. It carried trains until 2002, then closed for renovations. Before they could reopen it, an F1 tornado touched down in 2003 and destroyed most of the structure, leaving only the entrance tower standing, and the rest collapsed into the valley below. Now it was a state park, the ruined towers left as a monument to both human engineering and nature's power. Tourist attraction during the day, empty at night, supposed to be empty. Cameron Rodriguez, 37, park ranger for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. I'd drawn the night patrol shift for the Northern District, which included the Kinzua Bridge State Park. My job was to check the facilities, make sure no one was camping illegally or vandalizing the ruins. Simple work, usually quiet, usually uneventful. But that humming wasn't uneventful. That humming was wrong on every level. I approached the entrance to the observation deck, the part where tourists could walk out onto what remained of the bridge and look down into the valley. The humming grew louder as I got closer. And now I could feel it too. A vibration in the metal under my feet, like a train was approaching, except there was no train. Hadn't been a train in over 20 years. Then I heard the whistle. A train whistle. Steam engine, the kind they hadn't used since diesel took over in the 1950s. It echoed across the valley, mournful and clear, and my rational brain insisted it was just wind moving through the broken structure, creating sounds that only resembled a whistle. But wind didn't explain what I saw next. Lights appeared on the bridge that wasn't there anymore, the sections that had collapsed 18 years ago. I was looking at ghost light, phantom illumination showing me the viaduct as it used to be. Complete, intact, stretching across the valley with a train moving slowly across it, headlight cutting through the darkness. I could see the train clearly. Steam locomotive, passenger cars behind it, moving at a crawl like the engineer was being careful on the high crossing. Through the windows of the passenger cars, I could see people. Dozens of them sitting in the seats, their faces pressed against the glass, looking down at the valley below, looking at me. Every face was turned toward where I stood. Every expression was the same. Fear, realization, the moment of understanding that something was terribly wrong. And as I watched, the train reached the midpoint of the bridge, the exact point where the tornado had torn the structure apart in 2003. The train kept going, kept moving forward onto bridge that didn't exist anymore, steel that had fallen into the valley 18 years ago, and it fell. Slowly, impossibly slowly. The train tilted forward and began to drop, cars following the locomotive down into the darkness, and I could hear the screams now, dozens of voices screaming as they fell. The sound of impact was tremendous, metal tearing, wood shattering, the shriek of people dying. Then silence. The lights vanished, the train was gone. The bridge was just broken towers and empty air again. I radioed dispatch, my hands shaking. I need to report. I stopped, unsure what to report. A hallucination, a flashback to something that never happened. I need someone to check the valley below Kinzua Bridge. Now. What did you see? The dispatcher asked. Just send someone. I couldn't explain it, didn't want to explain it over the radio. The response team arrived an hour later. We descended into the valley with flashlights and searched the area below the bridge where I'd seen the phantom train fall. We found twisted metal from the 2003 collapse, rusted and overgrown with vegetation, but we also found something else. Human remains. Old ones, partially buried, scattered among the bridge debris. Not from 2003, much older. The forensic team estimated from the 1950s based on the clothing fragments and the level of decomposition. We found 34 bodies over the next week, all in the valley below the bridge, all consistent with having fallen from a great height, all dead for approximately 70 years. The historical research took another month. On August 27, 1952, a steam passenger train called the Mountain Express had crossed the Kinzua Viaduct heading south. Midway across, witnesses from the valley below reported seeing the train stop, then shake violently like something was wrong. But it continued across safely, reached the southern side, kept going. Or that's what the official record said. But passenger manifests showed 34 people had boarded the Mountain Express at its northern departure point. When the train reached its southern destination, only 6 passengers disembarked. The railroad company initially claimed the missing passengers had simply gotten off at an intermediate stop. But when families reported their loved ones never arrived anywhere, never came home, an investigation was launched. It went nowhere. The railroad insisted all passengers had safely crossed the viaduct. The 6 who arrived at the destination couldn't remember anything unusual about the journey. The missing 34 were eventually declared lost in unrelated incidents, deaths attributed to various causes or listed as missing persons. The case was quietly closed, but now we had bodies. Now we had evidence that 34 people had fallen from the Kinzua Viaduct in 1952, and their deaths had been covered up. I kept working night shifts at the park, but I paid more attention to the bridge now, and I wasn't the only one who saw things. Other rangers reported the humming, the phantom lights, the ghost train crossing the bridge that wasn't there anymore. Always at night, always between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., always reaching the midpoint and falling. One ranger captured video on his phone. It showed nothing, just the ruined towers and empty air. But the audio was clear. Train sounds, whistle, the screaming as it fell. The video went semi-viral online before park administration made him take it down, threatened him with termination if he continued talking about it. But people who lived near the park had stories going back decades. Locals said the bridge was haunted, that on certain nights you could see a train that wasn't there crossing a viaduct that had been destroyed. They said the tornado in 2003 hadn't created the haunting. It had just made it more visible. When the bridge was complete and functional, the ghost train could cross unnoticed. But once the center section collapsed, the phantom became obvious, a train crossing nothing, then falling as it should have fallen in 1952. I started researching the engineer of the Mountain Express, found his name in railroad records. Jonathan Webb, 42 years old, veteran of 20 years with the company. He'd survived the crossing, reached the southern station, and continued working for another 10 years before retiring. But according to his granddaughter, who I tracked down in Ohio, he'd never been the same after that day. He wouldn't talk about it, she told me, but sometimes he'd wake up screaming about the bridge. He said they'd hit something midway across, a vibration that shook the train violently. He said he looked back and the last 2 passenger cars were gone. Just gone, separated from the train, falling into the valley. He reported it to the company, but they told him he was wrong. Told him all the cars made it across intact. They showed him manifests proving every car had arrived safely. Made him doubt his own memory until he wasn't sure anymore what had really happened. But he knew people died, I said. He knew. He just couldn't prove it. And eventually, when enough people tell you you're wrong, when the official records contradict your memory, you start to doubt yourself. He spent the rest of his life wondering if he'd imagined it, if he'd had some kind of breakdown. It destroyed him. The bridge is still there, the ruined towers maintained as a memorial. During the day, thousands of tourists visit, walk out onto the observation deck, take photos of the dramatic collapse. At night, the park closes and the rangers patrol. And sometimes, on certain nights when the air is still and the moon is dark, the bridge rebuilds itself. The ghost of the complete viaduct appears, spanning the valley like it used to. And a train crosses it, moving slowly, carefully, carrying 34 passengers who've been falling for 70 years. They never hit the bottom. They just fall forever, screaming forever, trapped in the moment when the coupling failed and the last 2 cars separated from the train and dropped into the valley, And every night, when the phantom replay happens, they experience it again. The realization that something's wrong, the screaming as they fall, the endless moment before impact that never comes. I transferred out of the Northern District last year. I couldn't keep watching that train fall, couldn't keep hearing those screams echoing across the valley. Someone else patrols Kinzua Bridge at night now. Someone else stands at the base of those towers and feels the humming, sees the lights, witnesses the train that shouldn't exist crossing the bridge that isn't there anymore. The 34 bodies were buried properly, given memorial services. Their families notified after 70 years of waiting for answers. But their ghosts didn't leave. They're still crossing that bridge, still falling, still dying over and over in a moment that was erased from official history, but never really ended. If you visit Kinzua Bridge State Park, go during the day, walk the observation deck, read the historical markers, admire the engineering, and mourn the destruction, but leave before dark. Because after sunset, the park shows you a different history, the history that was covered up, the history that 34 people experienced but couldn't survive to report. And if you're ever near there at night and you hear a train whistle echo across the valley, don't go looking for it. Don't try to see the phantom train. Because once you witness it, once you see those faces pressed against the windows and hear them screaming as they fall, you'll carry that memory forever. You'll wake up at 2 a.m. hearing the same sounds, seeing the same lights, watching the same tragedy replay in your mind until you can't be sure anymore what's memory and what's happening right now. The viaduct shouldn't have been humming. The bridge shouldn't have been whole. The train shouldn't have existed. But they did, and they do. And they will continue to exist as long as the towers stand, and the memory of what happened in 1952 remains trapped in the steel and stone. Some accidents get covered up so completely that the only witnesses left are the dead. And the dead remember everything, even when the living choose to forget. The dam was supposed to protect the town, not drown it. But that's exactly what happened in 1889 when the South Fork Dam failed, and 20 million tons of water roared down the valley, obliterating everything in its path. Johnstown, Pennsylvania, population 30,000 tons, was nearly wiped off the map in minutes. Official death toll was 2209, but locals knew it was higher. Bodies were still being found years later, identified by scraps of clothing or dental records, or just the intuition of families who recognized their own. I was standing at the Johnstown Flood Museum looking at the wall of victim photographs when I noticed something wrong. In the reflection of the glass display case, I could see faces that weren't in the actual photographs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressed against the inside of the glass, looking out at me with expressions of confusion and terror. When I turned to look at the display directly, the faces were gone. Just the official photographs, historical images of identified victims. But in the reflection, in any reflective surface in that room, windows, polished floors, my phone screen, those extra faces appeared. Watching, waiting. Harper Castellano, 53, documentary filmmaker specializing in historical disasters. I'd come to Johnstown to research a film about the flood, interviewing descendants and historians, collecting stories that hadn't made it into the official narrative. The flood was Pennsylvania's deadliest disaster, a catastrophe caused by negligence. Wealthy industrialists had bought the dam and lake as a private resort, cut corners on maintenance, ignored warnings about the dam's instability. When it failed, 20 million tons of water traveling at 40 miles an hour hit Johnstown with the force of Niagara Falls. Buildings were obliterated, people were swept away mid-sentence, families were torn apart in seconds. Bodies were found miles downstream, some never identified, some never found at all. The museum curator noticed me staring at the reflections. "You see them too?" she asked quietly. "See what?" "The faces. The ones who aren't in the photographs. the ones who were never identified, never counted, never acknowledged. She moved closer, lowering her voice. They've been there since the museum opened. We don't talk about it officially, but every staff member has seen them. They appear in reflections, in glass, in water, in any surface that can hold an image. They're the uncounted dead, the people who disappeared so completely that history forgot them. How many? I asked. No one knows. Official count was 2,209, but witness accounts suggest thousands more were in town that day. Travelers, migrant workers, people passing through who had no one looking for them. When the flood hit, they vanished. No bodies recovered, no names recorded, no acknowledgement they ever existed. And they're still here. She nodded. They can't leave, can't move on. Because no one remembers them, no one speaks their names. They're trapped in that moment when the water hit, drowning forever, trying to make someone see them, count them, acknowledge that they lived and died. I started photographing every reflective surface in the museum, documenting the faces that appeared in glass, but not in reality. My camera caught them clearly, dozens of faces, all with the same expression of drowning, mouths open, eyes wide, caught forever in the moment the water took them. That night, in my hotel room near downtown Johnstown, I woke to the sound of water, not pipes or rain, a roar, like a river running through the room. I sat up and saw the walls were wet, water running down them in sheets. The floor was flooding, ankle deep and rising fast. I tried to get out of bed, but the water was too strong, pushing me back. I could see things floating in it, pieces of houses, broken furniture, bodies. So many bodies tumbling in the current, faces turning toward me as they passed. And then they started standing up. One by one, the bodies in the flood got to their feet, standing in water that was up to their chests, their faces blue and bloated, their eyes empty. They waded toward my bed, dozens of them, hundreds of them, all reaching for me with hands that were missing fingers or entire arms. "Count us," they said in unison, their voices gurgling like they were still underwater. "Count us. Say our names. We lived. We were here. Count us." "I don't know your names," I said, my voice breaking with terror. "Then find them. Make someone remember. We need to be counted. We need to matter. We've been drowning for 135 years, and no one will acknowledge we existed." The water reached the ceiling, filling the room completely, and I was drowning too, gasping for air that wasn't there, feeling the weight of 20 million tons pressing down on me. In the water around me, the uncounted dead continued wading forward, reaching for me, pulling me down into the flood that never ended. I woke up on the floor of my hotel room, gasping and soaked with sweat. The walls were dry, the floor was dry, but I could still feel the weight of that water, could still see those faces surrounding me. I spent the next 3 months researching, digging through archives and census records and newspaper accounts. I found evidence of hundreds of people who'd been in Johnstown on May 31st, 1889, who had no record after that day. Migrant workers building the railroad, traveling salesmen passing through, families visiting relatives, people who should have left traces but didn't. I compiled a list of names, everyone I could identify who'd likely been in town during the flood but wasn't included in the official death toll. It came to 347 names, 347 people who'd been erased from history, whose deaths weren't counted, whose existence was forgotten. I published the list, put it online, sent it to historical societies, had it added to the flood memorial. And the night the list went public, I had another dream. The same flood, the same room filling with water, the same bodies standing up. But this time, when they reached me, they didn't drag me down. They just touched my hand, one by one, and as each one made contact, they faded, dissolving into the water, finally released, finally able to rest now that someone had acknowledged they'd existed. Not all of them faded. Some remained, still reaching, still drowning. Because 347 names wasn't enough, there were more, many more people so forgotten that even intensive research couldn't recover their identities. The museum curator called me a week later. "The faces in the reflections," she said. "There are fewer of them now. Not gone, but fewer. You helped some of them. Not all of them. No, but more than anyone else has tried. They've been waiting for 135 years for someone to care enough to look for them. I still have the list, still update it when I find new evidence. I've added another 73 names in the past year. Each time I add a name, I visit the flood memorial and read it aloud, formally acknowledging that this person lived and died in Johnstown on May 31st, 1889. And each time I do, I feel the weight of the water lift slightly. Feel the count get a little more complete. Feel the forgotten dead move one step closer to being remembered. But the work isn't finished. There are still faces in the reflections. Still uncounted dead drowning in a flood that happened over a century ago. They're waiting for someone to find their names, to add them to the list, to make them count. If you visit Johnstown, if you see the Flood Museum or the memorial, take a moment to look at the reflective surfaces. Look at the glass, the water, the polished stone. See if you notice faces that shouldn't be there, people who aren't in the photographs but are in the reflections. Those are the uncounted, the forgotten, the people who died and were erased so completely that history forgot they ever lived. They're still there, still drowning, still waiting for someone to acknowledge their existence. And if you happen to be a researcher, if you have access to archives and census records and the time to dig through history looking for the lost, consider helping them. Find their names, add them to the count, make them matter. Because every person deserves to be remembered. Every death deserves to be acknowledged, and the uncounted dead of Johnstown have been waiting long enough for someone to care. The town was too perfect. Every building was period appropriate, maintained exactly as it would have been in the 1870s. Every street was clean, every window unbroken. The coal patches and company houses stood in neat rows, and the mine entrance gaped at the edge of town like a mouth frozen open in mid-scream. Eckley Miners' Village was a living history museum now, a preserved coal mining town where visitors could see how miners and their families lived in the 19th century. But when I arrived to begin my 3-month residency as a historical interpreter, something felt wrong. The town was too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath. Preston Ward, 34, historian specializing in industrial labor. I'd been hired to live in one of the company houses and give tours explaining coal mining life to visitors. It was a dream job, immersive historical research combined with education. 3 months of living in 1870 essentially, experiencing the routines and conditions of mining families. But on my first night in the house, I understood why the previous interpreter had quit after only 2 weeks. The house was authentic. No electricity, no running water, heated by a coal stove, furnished with period-appropriate items. I was supposed to live as a miner would have lived, using oil lamps and hauling water and sleeping on a straw mattress. Immersive history. At 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of boots on the porch. Heavy boots, multiple pairs, moving in formation. I looked out the window and saw them, a group of miners in work clothes, carrying lunch pails and tools, walking down the street toward the mine entrance. Dozens of them, maybe 50, moving in silence. I watched them disappear into the mine. Then, 10 minutes later, I heard the explosion. It was muffled, deep underground, but unmistakable. The ground shook, the house rattled, and from the mine entrance came a billow of dust and smoke. I ran outside expecting to see emergency response, people reacting to a cave-in or explosion. The street was empty. The mine entrance showed no sign of disturbance. When I reached it and looked inside, I saw nothing but darkness and old timbers, the same as it had been during my tour the previous afternoon, but I could smell smoke. Fresh smoke, coal dust, and explosives, and something else. Something organic and burning. In the morning, I asked the site manager about mines in the area still being active, about any blasting work that might be happening. She looked at me strangely. The mine here has been closed since 1935. There's no active mining for miles. Why? I described what I'd heard. She got very quiet, then said, "You heard the 1869 explosion." "What?" "January 14th, 1869. Gas ignited in the main shaft. Killed 64 men and boys. They were buried in a mass grave just outside town. The company tried to cover it up, said it was only 43 dead, tried to minimize the disaster. But everyone knew, the families knew. And they replay it. Some interpreters hear it. Some see the miners walking to their shift. Some smell the smoke. It happens every January 14th at 3:17 a.m., the exact moment the explosion happened. "It's November," I said. She frowned. "It only happens in January, on the anniversary." But I'd heard it in November. I'd seen the miners walking. Which meant either I was hallucinating, or the date of the replay was wrong, or something was happening in Eckley that went beyond simple anniversary hauntings. I started researching the 1869 disaster, digging through archives and company records. The official death toll was 43, but witness accounts from the time suggested more miners had been in the shaft, many of them children as young as 8, who worked as breaker boys and weren't officially on company rolls. I found a list of names. 64 men and boys who'd been reported missing after the explosion by their families, even though the company only acknowledged 43. 21 miners whose deaths were denied, whose families received no compensation, whose graves had no markers. And every night at 3 a.m. I heard the boots on the porch. Every night I saw the miners walking to the shaft, and every night I heard the explosion and smelled the smoke. I wasn't the only one. Other staff reported experiencing the same things, regardless of the date. The haunting was accelerating, happening every night instead of once a year, as if the 21 unacknowledged dead were becoming more insistent, more desperate to be counted. I compiled a memorial list, all 64 names, and proposed adding it to the site's historical markers. The State Historical Commission rejected it. Insufficient documentation, they said. The company records showed 43 dead, and without definitive proof of additional victims, they couldn't acknowledge more. So I installed my own marker. Nothing official, just a wooden plaque with 64 names carved into it, placed near the mine entrance. In memory of all who died here, acknowledged and unacknowledged. That night, I heard the boots again, saw the miners walking, but this time, when they reached the mine entrance, they stopped, turned toward my plaque, and one by one, they faded away. Not all of them. 21 figures remained, the 21 whose names I'd been unable to verify, who still weren't officially counted. But the majority were gone. Released, allowed to rest now that someone had acknowledged their deaths. The state removed my plaque a week later. Unauthorized installation, they said, against historical site regulations. But I'd taken photos, documented every name, and I kept researching, kept looking for evidence of those final 21 miners. I found 12 more names over the next year, added them to my documentation. Read them aloud at the mine entrance. Each time I did, one more figure stopped appearing in the 3 a.m. walk. 9 remain. 9 miners whose names I haven't found, whose existence I can't prove, who walk to the mine every night and die in an explosion that was never fully acknowledged. I don't work at Eckley anymore. My residency ended and I wasn't invited back after the unauthorized plaque incident. But I still research those final 9 names, still look through census records and church registries and any document that might give me a name to add to the count. Because they're still walking, still dying, still waiting for someone to care enough to count them, to acknowledge that they lived and worked and died in that mine on January 14th, 1869. If you visit Eckley Miners' Village, look at the mine entrance. Look at the shadows there, especially if you're there early in the morning. You might see figures walking, miners heading to a shift that ended 155 years ago. And if you do, remember that some of them are still unacknowledged, still uncounted, still hoping that someone will care enough to find their names and make them matter. The town is too perfect because it's frozen in the moment before the explosion. The moment when all those miners were still alive, still walking to work, still believing they'd come home at the end of their shift. Eckley preserves that moment, holds it like amber, and the miners who died are trapped in it, reliving their last walk forever because history won't acknowledge they existed. Count the uncounted. Name the unnamed. Give the forgotten their identity back. It's the least the living can do for the dead who built the industry that built Pennsylvania. The water was running backwards. I was standing on the bank of Oil Creek near Titusville at midnight, and the current was flowing uphill, moving south to north instead of north to south, defying gravity and physics and everything I understood about how rivers worked. And it was glowing, faint blue-green bioluminescence rippling across the surface like the creek had swallowed the stars. Oil Creek had a complicated history. Site of Pennsylvania's first oil boom in the 1859, it had been so polluted with petroleum runoff by the 1870s that the water itself would catch fire. People would light the creek for entertainment, watching flames dance across the surface, while oil companies made fortunes pulling black gold from the ground. Now it was clean, or supposed to be. The oil boom had ended, the derricks were gone, and environmental recovery had restored the creek to something resembling its natural state. I was there to document that recovery for a conservation magazine, taking water samples and photographs to show how nature could heal even the worst industrial damage. But the backwards flowing, glowing water suggested something else was happening in Oil Creek, something that had nothing to do with normal ecology. Autumn Hayes, 29, environmental journalist and photographer. I'd been camping along the creek for 3 days, documenting wildlife and water quality. Everything had been normal until tonight, when I'd woken to a sound I couldn't identify, low, rhythmic, almost like breathing, coming from the creek. I'd gone to investigate and found the water flowing wrong and glowing. As I watched, the surface began to ripple in patterns that didn't match the current. Circles expanding from central points, like stones being dropped into the water, except there were no stones, no objects disturbing the surface. Then the creek spoke. Not metaphorically. The water itself produced sound, emerging from the current in a voice that was layered and strange, like multiple people speaking in perfect synchronization. The words were clear. We were promised prosperity. We were told the earth's blood would make us rich. We drank it. We burned it. We drowned in it. I backed away from the creek bank, my rational mind insisting this was some auditory hallucination, some trick of water moving over rocks. But the voice continued, and it was addressing me directly now. You come to photograph recovery, but we are not recovered. We are changed. We drank so much oil that we became oil. The creek is us now. We flow through it. We are the pollution that never left. Who are you? I asked, feeling absurd, but unable to stop myself. The workers, the drillers, the men who built the derricks and died in the fires, the children who fell into the creek and suffocated on crude oil, the women who drank contaminated water and died slowly of cancer and liver failure. We were promised prosperity. We got death. And when we died, we didn't leave. We sank into the creek and became part of it. We've been flowing here for 160 years, unable to rest, unable to dissolve. Oil doesn't break down. It just spreads, and we spread with it. The glowing intensified, and I could see shapes in the water now. human forms made of liquid, bodies composed of creek water and residual petroleum, flowing with the current. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all moving backwards against the natural direction, pulled by something upstream. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To the source. To Drake's well. To the place where it started. We make this pilgrimage every night, flowing upstream to the first oil well, trying to close it, trying to undo what began there. But we can't. The well is capped, but the wound is still open. The earth is still bleeding, and we're still dying." I followed the creek upstream, walking along the bank, watching the backwards flow and the glowing forms within it. They moved with purpose, with intention, a river of the dead flowing against nature toward the site where Pennsylvania's oil industry had been born. Drake's Well Museum was 3 miles upstream, closed at this hour. The replica, derrick dark and silent. But as the backwards creek reached it, as those glowing forms arrived at the source, something happened. The ground around the original well site began to bubble. Black crude oil seeped up through soil that should have been clean, that had been remediated and tested and declared safe. It pooled around the historical markers, spread across the grass, crept toward the creek, and the forms in the water screamed. A collective sound of anguish and rage, the voices of everyone who died from oil extraction over 160 years, all speaking at once through the medium of contaminated water. "The earth is still bleeding," they said. "The wound never closed. You cleaned the surface, but the poison runs deep. We are its expression. We are its memory. And we will flow backwards every night until the bleeding stops." The oil seeping from the ground reached the creek and mixed with the water, turning it black. The glow faded as the petroleum spread, and the forms dissolved, unable to maintain coherence in the renewed contamination. I documented everything: photos, video, water samples from both the glowing creek and the oil seeping from the ground. When I brought it to the state environmental department, they tested the samples. The oil was real, modern analysis confirmed. Fresh crude still seeping from the Drake's well site despite all the cleanup efforts. They investigated, drilled test wells, found that the original oil reservoir had never been properly sealed. Petroleum was still leaking, still contaminating the groundwater, still flowing into Oil Creek in quantities too small to notice during the day, but accumulating at night when flow rates changed. The site was shut down for remediation. The leaking well was properly kept. The contaminated soil was excavated. It took 6 months, but eventually the testing showed clean water throughout the Oil Creek watershed, and the backwards flow stopped. The glowing stopped. The voices stopped. But I still go back sometimes, walking the creek bank at night, listening to the water, checking to make sure it's flowing in the right direction, watching for any sign of that blue-green luminescence that would indicate the dead were flowing again, still trying to reach the source, still trying to close a wound that history had forgotten about. Oil Creek is clean now, officially. The environmental recovery is documented and celebrated, but I know what's still there, deep in the ground, waiting. The reservoirs were never fully emptied. The wells were never all found. Pennsylvania sits on centuries of extraction, on wounds in the earth that were never properly closed, on pollution that sank so deep it became part of the geology. And the people who died from it, who were promised prosperity and got poison instead, they're still there too, dissolved into the water, mixed with the chemicals, flowing through the creeks and rivers and aquifers, unable to rest because the contamination that killed them is still present, still active, still seeping from the ground. If you visit Oil Creek State Park, if you camp along the water or walk the trails that follow the creek, pay attention to the current. Make sure it's flowing downstream, north to south, following gravity and nature. Because if you see it flowing backwards, if you see that blue-green glow on the surface, if you hear voices speaking from the water, you'll know the wound has reopened. The earth is bleeding again, and the dead are making their pilgrimage to the source, trying to close it one more time. They were promised prosperity. They built an industry. They drilled the wells and refined the oil and died from the pollution it created. And they deserved to rest. They deserved to flow in the right direction, downstream toward peace instead of upstream toward the injury that killed them. Count them, acknowledge them. Remember that industrial progress has a human cost, and sometimes that cost is still being paid. Long after the derricks are gone, and the boom has ended, and the land is declared clean. The town was supposed to be abandoned, but when I arrived in Austin, Pennsylvania, what was left of it after the dam failure in 1911, there was smoke coming from one of the chimneys. A single house at the edge of the disaster zone, still standing, still occupied, in a town that had been evacuated and condemned over a century ago. The Austin Dam disaster killed anywhere from 78 to 152 people, depending on which estimate you believed. The dam failed suddenly, sending a wall of water 40 feet high through the valley, obliterating the town. Most of the bodies were never found, washed miles downstream or buried under the rubble of destroyed buildings. What remained of Austin was ruins and foundations, a ghost town in the truest sense. The state had relocated survivors, bulldozed the unstable structures, and eventually just let the forest reclaim the site. Now it was barely visible through the trees. A few walls still standing, some concrete foundations, and the remains of the dam itself. But that chimney was smoking. Someone was living there. I'm Felix Mora, 47, urban explorer and photographer documenting abandoned towns across America. I'd hiked into Austin with camping gear and camera equipment, planning to spend a week photographing what remained and researching the disaster for a book I was writing about flood-destroyed communities. The house with the smoking chimney wasn't on any map. It shouldn't have existed, but it was there, solid and real, with curtains in the windows and a woodpile beside the porch, and a garden that looked recently tended despite it being late November. I approached carefully, called out a greeting. The front door opened, and an elderly woman looked out at me. She was maybe 80, dressed in clothes that looked handmade, wool and cotton in patterns from another era. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, not hostile, just stating a fact. "I'm documenting the town," I explained, "for a historical project. I didn't realize anyone still lived here." "No one does," she said. "Just me. I'm the last resident of Austin. I've been here since 1911, since the flood." I did the math. If she'd been here since 1911, she'd be over 10 years old. But she looked maybe 80, her movements spry, her eyes clear. "You survived the flood?" I asked. "I died in it." She said it matter-of-factly, like discussing the weather. "I was 7 years old. The water came and I drowned, but I couldn't leave. This was my home. So I stayed, and I've been here ever since, watching the years pass, watching the seasons change, watching everyone else leave while I remain." She invited me inside. The house was furnished simply but comfortably, with a wood stove radiating heat and oil lamps providing light. There was no electricity, no running water, no modern amenities. It was as if the house existed in 1911, preserved in the moment before the flood. "My name was Emily Brennan," she said, pouring tea from a kettle. Is. I'm never sure which tense to use. I was the youngest of 5 children. My father worked at the pulp mill. My mother took in laundry. We were poor but happy. And then the dam failed and everything ended. "But you're still here," I said, accepting the tea even though every rational part of my brain said this couldn't be real. This was a dream or a hallucination or something I'd misunderstood. "A piece of me stayed," she said. "The part that didn't want to leave home. The part that thought if I just waited here, my family would come back. They never did, of course. They all died. Some in the flood, some later from injuries and illness, but I stayed. And after a while, I realized I was the only one who remembered what Austin was like before. the only one who held the memory of the living town. She showed me photographs, though they couldn't have been real photographs. They were too clear, too vivid, showing scenes from 1911 Austin with color and detail that old cameras couldn't capture. Images of her family, her neighbors, the town on normal days when people went to work and children played in the streets. No one knew a wall of water was coming. "I'm the memory," she said. "As long as I'm here, as long as I remember, the town still exists. Not physically, but in memory. And memory matters. It's what separates the living from the dead, the remembered from the forgotten." I spent 3 days with Emily Brennan, documenting her stories, photographing the impossible house that shouldn't exist. She told me about every family in Austin, every business, every small drama and joy that had filled the town's short life. She remembered everything, held 113 years of memories in perfect detail. On the third night, she said, "I'm tired. I've been here so long. I've held these memories for so long. I think I'm ready to let them go now, to finally leave." "Where will you go?" I asked. "Wherever people go when they stop being memory and become history. When someone else takes the responsibility of remembering." She handed me a book, a journal she'd been writing in for over a century, filled with names and dates and stories from Austin. Every person who'd lived there, every detail of the town's existence, preserved in her handwriting. "This is yours now," she said. "The memory of Austin. Keep it. Share it. Make sure people know we were here, that we lived and loved and built lives in this valley. Don't let us be just a disaster. Let us be a town." She walked me to the door as dawn broke. "Don't come back," she said gently. "Once I leave, the house will leave too. It's only here because I'm here. When I'm gone, it will dissolve back into the ruins where it belongs." I hiked out of Austin that morning, carrying Emily's journal. When I looked back from the ridge, I could see the house clearly, smoke still rising from the chimney. But as I watched, it began to fade. Not dramatically, just gradually becoming transparent, like morning fog burning off. Within an hour, it was gone completely, and the forest grew where it had stood. I've published Emily's journal, made it available online, donated copies to libraries and historical societies. The memory of Austin lives in those pages, in her careful documentation of a town that died in minutes but deserved to be remembered for more than its disaster. Sometimes I get messages from people who've hiked into the Austin ruins looking for the house. They never find it. It doesn't exist anymore, not even as a ghost. Emily Brennan finally left. Finally released her century-long vigil. Finally allowed herself to dissolve into history instead of remaining frozen in memory. But I know she was real. I have the journal, have the photographs I took, have the memories of our conversations, and I know that somewhere in the Pennsylvania wilderness, in the ruins of a town that was destroyed in 1911, there was someone who stayed behind long after everyone else left. Someone who held the memory of the living town, who refused to let Austin be reduced to a death toll and a disaster date. She was the last resident, the last witness, the last keeper of the memory. And now that responsibility has passed to the living, to those of us who can read her words and learn the names and understand that before the flood, before the disaster, Austin was a town full of people who deserved to be remembered for how they lived, not just how they died. If you research Pennsylvania disasters, if you study the Austin Dam failure of 1911, take a moment to read beyond the statistics. Learn the names, hear the stories. Remember that each number in the death toll was a person with a life and a family, and dreams that ended when the wall of water hit. They were the residents of Austin. They lived there. They mattered. And as long as we remember them, as long as we speak their names and tell their stories, they're not completely gone. They're still there, in memory, in history, in the words of the last resident who stayed behind to make sure they were never forgotten. Count the dead, name the victims. but also remember the living, who they were before disaster came, what they built, what they loved, what they were planning for the future before the water took it all away. That's what Emily Brennan did for 113 years. That's what I'm doing now, and if you're reading this, it's what you're doing too. Keeping Austen alive in the only way it can still exist, in the memory of the living, who refused to let the dead be forgotten.